Ladies and gentlemen, throughout history, there have been prisons that became more than just detention centers. They became symbols of oppression, places where justice was abandoned and cruelty reigned. Among these, Tadmor Prison in Syria stands out as one of the most brutal and feared prisons in the Middle East. Imagine a fortress of despair, hidden deep in the heart of the desert, where thousands of prisoners suffered in silence, knowing that the outside world had forgotten them. Imagine a place where political opponents, intellectuals, and ordinary civilians, guilty of nothing but expressing their opinions, were locked away indefinitely. Tadmor was not merely a prison, it was a weapon of fear, a tool used by the ruling regime to crush dissent and spread terror among the people. Unlike ordinary prisons designed to rehabilitate criminals, Tadmor had a different purpose altogether. It was a place where human dignity was stripped away, where hope was extinguished, and where suffering was not just common, it was routine. Those who entered its gates rarely came out, and if they did, they carried scars, both physical and psychological, that would never heal. The story of Tadmor is not just about the prison itself, but about the countless lives it destroyed. It is a reminder of the darkest depths to which humanity can sink when absolute power goes unchecked. Today, we will delve into its grim history, its horrific conditions, and the terror it inflicted upon its victims. We will remember the thousands who suffered within its walls, not just as statistics, but as individuals whose voices were silenced by cruelty. Tadmor Prison was more than a place. It was a nightmare that lasted for decades, leaving an indelible mark on Syria and the world. Let us take a closer look at the horror that unfolded within its walls and the legacy it left behind. To truly understand the horrors of Tadmor Prison, we must first look at its origins. Located in the arid Syrian desert, near the ancient city of Palmyra, Tadmor was not originally built as a prison. In fact, its beginnings were far less sinister. It was constructed as a military barracks during the French Mandate of Syria in the early 20th century. Its remote location made it an ideal site for a military installation, but over time, its purpose took a dark turn. As political tensions in Syria escalated throughout the 20th century, the need for a place to detain opponents of the government grew. In the 1950s and 1960s, Tadmor was gradually transformed from a military outpost into a high-security prison. However, it was in the 1970s, under the rule of the country's leader at the time, that Tadmor Prison became a true house of horrors. The prison was repurposed not just to hold criminals, but to suppress political dissent. Activists, students, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of opposing the government were sent here. What made Tadmor particularly infamous was that many of these prisoners had never been convicted of any crime. Many were arrested arbitrarily without trials and thrown into cells where they remained indefinitely, cut off from the outside world. Tadmor's transformation into a symbol of terror was gradual but deliberate. The ruling regime understood the power of fear, and Tadmor became one of its most effective tools. It was not just a place of imprisonment, it was a message to the people of Syria: oppose the government, and this is where you will end up. Families of prisoners often had no idea if their loved ones were alive or dead, and the mere mention of Tadmor struck fear into the hearts of citizens. By the late 20th century, Tadmor Prison had earned a reputation as one of the most brutal detention centers in the world. Reports from former prisoners and human rights organizations painted a grim picture of systematic torture, inhumane conditions, and mass executions. But despite the horrific stories that leaked out, the prison continued to operate, serving as a silent yet powerful reminder of the regime's iron grip over the country. The story of Tadmor is not just about a building. It is about the suffering of thousands who passed through its gates, never knowing if they would see freedom again. Its history is a chilling testament to the extent to which absolute power can corrupt, turning a simple military barracks into one of the most feared institutions in the Middle East. Tadmor Prison was strategically located in one of the most desolate regions of Syria, deep in the heart of the eastern desert near the ancient city of Palmyra. This location was no accident. It was chosen deliberately. The barren landscape surrounding the prison made escape nearly impossible, with miles of scorching sand stretching in every direction. Any prisoner who managed to flee the compound would face dehydration and exhaustion before ever reaching civilization. The very geography of Tadmor was a weapon in itself, ensuring that those sent there had little hope of escape. The prison complex was heavily fortified, with high walls, watchtowers, and strict military surveillance. It was designed not just to contain prisoners, but to isolate them from the outside world. Unlike ordinary prisons that function within a legal system, Tadmor operated in a shadowy realm where laws and human rights meant nothing. Prisoners were held indefinitely, often without trial or formal charges. Their fate was entirely in the hands of those who ran the facility, making Tadmor more than a prison. It was a place of disappearance. The primary purpose of Tadmor was political repression. While some criminals were indeed housed there, the majority of its inmates were political dissidents, activists, intellectuals, and even ordinary citizens who had spoken out against the government. In many cases, these individuals had done nothing more than express an opinion, criticize the regime in private, or be suspected of sympathizing with opposition groups. The prison became a tool for silencing opposition, a place where voices of dissent were buried, sometimes literally. Tadmor was not just about punishing individuals, it was about instilling fear in the entire nation. The regime used it as a warning. Anyone who dared to challenge authority could end up behind its walls, suffering unimaginable horrors. The secrecy surrounding the prison only added to its terrifying reputation. Families of detainees rarely received information about their loved ones. In many cases, prisoners simply vanished, their families left to wonder if they were still alive. The psychological impact of Tadmor extended far beyond its walls. It became a symbol of oppression, a dark reminder of what could happen to those who opposed the government. The mere mention of its name was enough to silence critics and force people into submission. The regime's message was clear. Obedience meant survival, while defiance meant suffering in the desert fortress of Tadmor. Tadmor Prison was not just a place of confinement. It was a chamber of torment where inmates endured some of the most inhumane conditions imaginable. The facility was designed not only to isolate prisoners from the outside world, but also to break them physically, mentally, and emotionally. The conditions inside were so horrific that many detainees did not survive, and those who did carried lifelong scars, both visible and invisible. The cells were small, overcrowded, and devoid of basic necessities. Prisoners were crammed together, often forced to share a tiny space with dozens of others. There was no ventilation, no proper sanitation, and no access to clean water. The intense desert heat made the cells suffocating, while the freezing nights left inmates shivering without blankets or warm clothing. Disease spread rapidly due to the unsanitary conditions, and medical care was almost non-existent. Even the most basic medical attention was denied to prisoners, leading to slow, agonizing deaths from infections, untreated injuries, and malnutrition. Food was deliberately kept scarce, often consisting of nothing more than scraps of stale bread and contaminated water. Malnourishment weakened prisoners to the point of collapse, making them more vulnerable to disease and physical abuse. Hunger was used as a weapon, reducing inmates to a state of perpetual suffering. Those who asked for more food were often met with brutal beatings instead of sympathy. Hygiene was practically non-existent. Prisoners were rarely allowed to bathe, and many went months without a change of clothes. Lice, fleas, and other parasites thrived in these filthy conditions. The lack of proper sanitation meant that prisoners had to relieve themselves in small buckets inside their already cramped cells, adding to the unbearable stench that filled the prison. Showers were rare, and when they were permitted, they were often used as another form of punishment. Prisoners were blasted with freezing water or forced to bathe in contaminated basins. Perhaps the most unbearable part of life in Tadmor was the complete lack of human dignity. Prisoners were not treated as human beings, but as disposable objects. Guards would randomly enter cells to beat inmates, sometimes for no reason other than to remind them of their helplessness. Sleep deprivation was another common tactic used to weaken and disorient prisoners. Inmates were kept awake for days, either through loud noises, sudden interrogations, or the constant threat of violence. The psychological toll was immense. Living under constant fear, not knowing if they would be tortured or executed at any moment, drove many prisoners to the brink of insanity. Some lost their grip on reality, while others were so broken that they simply stopped speaking or responding to their surroundings. The isolation from the outside world only added to the despair. Many prisoners had no idea if their families even knew where they were, or if they were still alive. The inhumane conditions of Tadmor Prison were not the result of neglect or mismanagement. They were intentional. Every aspect of life inside was designed to strip prisoners of their will, to make them feel powerless, and to ensure that they never posed a threat to the regime again. The prison was not just a place of punishment. It was a place of slow, calculated destruction, where suffering was a daily reality and death was often seen as a mercy. Among the many horrifying events that took place within the walls of Tadmor Prison, none were as brutal or infamous as the massacre of June 27, 1980. This single event solidified Tadmor's reputation as one of the most feared prisons in the world and served as a chilling reminder of the lengths to which a regime would go to eliminate dissent. The massacre was not the result of a spontaneous riot or an escape attempt. It was a calculated act of mass murder, ordered from the highest levels of authority. It was a response to an assassination attempt on the country's leader just one day earlier. Although the attack had been unsuccessful, the government's retaliation was swift, merciless, and directed not at the perpetrators, but at those who had already been imprisoned, many of whom had never been formally charged with a crime. In the early hours of June 27th, hundreds of soldiers from an elite military unit were dispatched to Tadmor Prison with a single directive: eliminate as many inmates as possible. The prisoners had no warning, no chance to plead for their lives, and no means of defending themselves. The soldiers stormed the prison in coordinated waves, armed with automatic weapons and carrying out their orders with chilling efficiency. Inmates were dragged from their cells, lined up in the courtyards, and gunned down in groups. Others were slaughtered inside their cells, executed where they stood, with bullets ripping through the thin, overcrowded walls. Some were reportedly forced to kneel before being shot in the head at point-blank range. There were no trials, no distinctions between those who were guilty or innocent, only an indiscriminate massacre that lasted for hours. The exact number of those killed remains uncertain, but estimates suggest that between 500 to 1,000 prisoners were executed that day. Their bodies were either dumped into mass graves or incinerated, erasing any trace of their existence. Families of the victims were never officially notified. Many only realized what had happened when their loved ones never returned, their names vanishing from prison records as if they had never existed. What made the Tadmor massacre even more terrifying was its deliberate message. It was not just an act of revenge. It was a demonstration of absolute power. The regime wanted the people of Syria to know that it would go to any lengths to crush opposition, that even those already imprisoned were not beyond its reach. The massacre sent a wave of fear across the country, silencing voices of dissent and reinforcing the idea that no one was safe. For those who survived, the massacre was a psychological wound that never healed. Many prisoners were forced to watch their cellmates executed before their eyes, knowing they could be next. The walls of Tadmor, already stained with suffering, absorbed yet another layer of horror. Even after the gunfire ceased and the soldiers left, the prison remained a graveyard, silent, blood-soaked, and haunted by the screams of the fallen. Tadmor Prison was not merely a detention center. It was a chamber of horrors where torture was institutionalized. The prison authorities did not just seek to punish inmates. They aimed to break them, physically and psychologically, using some of the most brutal methods ever documented. For many prisoners, survival was not about avoiding execution. It was about enduring the relentless torment inflicted upon them daily. Torture at Tadmor was not random or occasional. It was systematic, carefully orchestrated to instill maximum suffering. From the moment a prisoner arrived, they were subjected to the first act of brutality known as the welcome party. This was a savage beating carried out by guards as soon as inmates stepped through the gates. Stripped of their clothes, blindfolded and shackled, they were beaten with whips, batons, and rifle butts before being thrown into their cells, bruised and bleeding. Some prisoners did not even survive this initial greeting. Once inside, torture became a routine part of life. One of the most feared methods was the flying carpet, a device resembling a wooden board to which prisoners were tied. Their bodies were bent backward in an unnatural position, and then they were beaten mercilessly. The pain was excruciating, often causing dislocations, broken bones, or internal bleeding. Another infamous method was electrocution. Prisoners were tied up and subjected to electric shocks on the most sensitive parts of their bodies: ears, fingers, genitals, and even tongues. The shocks were administered in varying intensities, sometimes strong enough to cause convulsions, unconsciousness, or even death. Beatings were relentless and could happen at any time, for any reason or no reason at all. Guards would enter cells with cables, rubber hoses, and wooden sticks, thrashing prisoners until they collapsed. The torment was not limited to physical pain. The psychological torture was just as cruel. Prisoners were often forced to witness the torture or execution of their cellmates. Some were made to watch as their friends were brutally beaten to death, knowing they could be next. Sleep deprivation was another common tactic. Prisoners were kept awake for days on end, either by being forced to stand for hours without rest or by being repeatedly dragged out of their cells for interrogations. The mental toll was devastating, pushing many to the brink of madness. Some inmates were confined to tiny, dark cells for months or years, deprived of human contact. Solitary confinement in Tadmor was not just about isolation, it was a slow, psychological death sentence. Sexual violence and humiliation were also used as tools of control. Prisoners were stripped naked, mocked, and subjected to degrading acts designed to break their spirits. Some were forced to crawl on all fours like animals while guards laughed and beat them. Others were made to bark like dogs or kiss the boots of their torturers. These acts were meant to erase their humanity, to make them feel like nothing more than objects of abuse. For many, the worst torture was the uncertainty. Prisoners never knew when the next round of abuse would come or if they would even survive the night. They were left in a constant state of terror, their bodies battered, and their minds shattered. The suffering inside Tadmor was beyond comprehension. It was a place where pain was routine, where screams echoed through the halls day and night, and where hope was a distant memory. The prison was not just a facility. It was a monument to cruelty, a living nightmare from which few emerged unscathed. Tadmor Prison was never just a facility for criminals. It was a political weapon, wielded by the regime to suppress dissent, silence opposition, and instill fear across Syria. The very existence of Tadmor sent a clear message. Anyone who dared to challenge authority, question the government, or even associate with the wrong people could vanish into its walls, never to return. From the 1970s onward, Tadmor became a central pillar of the regime's repressive machinery. It was not just a place of incarceration, it was a psychological tool used to govern through terror. The prison held a vast array of political prisoners, including activists, intellectuals, students, journalists, and members of opposition movements. Some had openly criticized the government, while others were arrested based on mere suspicion, without trial or evidence. In many cases, individuals were taken from their homes in the middle of the night, blindfolded, and transported to Tadmor, where they were thrown into cells without any formal charges. One of the most terrifying aspects of Tadmor was the complete lack of legal process. There were no fair trials, no appeals, and often no official records of imprisonment. Families of detainees were rarely informed of their whereabouts, leaving loved ones to search for years, sometimes in vain. Many prisoners simply disappeared, their fate unknown. In some cases, the only confirmation of their deaths came years later when other inmates who had survived were released and recounted the horrors they had witnessed. Inside the prison, political prisoners were treated with extreme brutality. They were seen not just as enemies of the state, but as individuals who needed to be utterly broken. The guards subjected them to relentless torture, starvation, and psychological torment, ensuring that even if they were ever released, they would never pose a threat to the regime again. Many were forced to sign false confessions under duress, admitting to crimes they had never committed. Others were paraded before cameras, beaten and bruised, as a warning to those outside that defiance would be met with unbearable consequences. Tadmor's role in political repression extended beyond its walls. The mere mention of the prison was enough to silence critics. People learned to censor themselves, to avoid political discussions, and to steer clear of anyone who might be under government surveillance. The fear of being sent to Tadmor was so deeply ingrained in Syrian society that entire families would avoid speaking about politics, knowing that a single word could lead to imprisonment or worse. The repression was not limited to individuals. It targeted entire groups. Political movements, opposition parties, and ideological organizations were dismantled through mass arrests, with their members thrown into Tadmor and other secret detention centers. The goal was not just to punish those who opposed the regime, but to create an environment where opposition was unthinkable. By making examples of those who were detained and tortured, the government ensured that others would not dare to follow in their footsteps. The psychological warfare extended to families of the imprisoned as well. Wives, children, and parents of detainees lived in perpetual uncertainty, never knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. Many were harassed or threatened by security forces, warned against speaking out or seeking information. The prison was not just a place of physical suffering. It cast a shadow of fear over the entire country, controlling people's thoughts and behaviors through the threat of unspeakable punishment. Tadmor was not an ordinary prison. It was a place where political resistance was crushed, where ideals were beaten out of people, and where entire movements were dismantled through fear. It was not just about locking people away. It was about destroying the very idea of opposition, making sure that no one dared to rise against the regime again. Tadmor Prison's horrors did not remain hidden forever. Over the years, testimonies from former prisoners, human rights organizations, and investigative journalists exposed the systematic cruelty that took place within its walls. The international community, though often slow to act, eventually began to acknowledge Tadmor as one of the most notorious symbols of state oppression and human rights violations in modern history. Reports from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and other advocacy groups detailed the appalling conditions and widespread use of torture within Tadmor. Survivors who managed to escape Syria or were released shared harrowing accounts of what they endured, accounts that shocked even those familiar with the worst forms of state-sponsored repression. The world learned of prisoners being electrocuted, beaten to death, and executed without trial. The infamous 1980 massacre, where hundreds of inmates were slaughtered in a single day, became one of the most widely documented atrocities linked to the prison. International legal standards, including the United Nations Convention Against Torture, prohibit the types of abuse that were routine in Tadmor. Yet, for decades, the Syrian government ignored global pressure, refusing to acknowledge the extent of the atrocities committed there. Appeals from human rights organizations demanding investigations, access for independent observers, or the closure of the facility were met with silence or outright denial. The regime insisted that Tadmor was a prison for criminals, not political dissidents, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Diplomatic pressure did increase over time, but real action was limited. Western governments condemned Syria's human rights record in official statements, yet concrete measures, such as sanctions targeting those responsible for Tadmor's abuses, were often slow or ineffective. Political considerations and regional alliances played a role in shaping the world's response. Some nations, despite their vocal criticism of human rights abuses, maintained diplomatic or economic ties with Syria, prioritizing strategic interests over justice for Tadmor's victims. Despite the overwhelming evidence of crimes against humanity, accountability remained elusive. Many of those responsible for the torture and executions at Tadmor never faced trial. The prison's legacy became part of a broader conversation about impunity in authoritarian regimes, highlighting the difficulty of holding oppressive governments accountable for their actions. Even after the prison was eventually closed, the scars it left on Syria's political landscape and on the families of those who suffered there could not be erased. The revelations about Tadmor's abuses also contributed to growing international awareness of state repression in the Middle East. Other prisons in the region, where similar atrocities took place, came under scrutiny as human rights organizations expanded their investigations. The global outcry over Tadmor set a precedent for how international bodies documented and responded to systematic torture and extrajudicial killings. While the world did eventually acknowledge Tadmor as a site of grave human rights violations, many questions remained. Could more have been done to stop the suffering sooner? Why did so many governments turn a blind eye for so long? The failure to intervene in meaningful ways only reinforced the perception that authoritarian regimes could act with impunity, so long as their actions did not directly threaten global stability. Tadmor became more than just a prison. It became a symbol of the world's struggle to address human rights abuses effectively. It served as a grim reminder that political interests often outweigh moral obligations, leaving countless victims without justice, their suffering acknowledged but not avenged. After decades of horror, Tadmor Prison was finally shut down, bringing an end to one of the most infamous detention centers in modern history. However, its closure was not necessarily a victory for justice. For years, human rights organizations, former prisoners, and international observers had called for its dismantling, but the decision to close the facility came not as a result of global pressure, but rather as part of shifting political dynamics within Syria. Even in its demolition, Tadmor remained a tool of political strategy rather than an admission of past crimes. The official shutdown of the prison was announced in 2001, but its legacy of brutality could not be so easily erased. By the time its gates were finally locked, countless lives had been destroyed within its walls. Families who had spent years searching for loved ones still had no answers. Many prisoners had simply disappeared, with no official records confirming their fates. For those who had suffered there and managed to survive, the closure of Tadmor was not justice. It was merely the removal of a physical structure that had long represented fear and oppression. Despite the announcement of its closure, the prison did not immediately cease operations. In the years following, there were reports that parts of the facility were still being used for detention, albeit with less visibility. Even as the government sought to publicly distance itself from Tadmor's gruesome reputation, secret detention centers continued to exist elsewhere in the country, following the same patterns of abuse. The name, Tadmor, may have been erased from official documents, but its methods of repression lived on. Then, in 2015, Tadmor Prison was dramatically demolished, not by the Syrian government, but by ISIS. The militant group, which had taken control of the area during the Syrian civil war, made a spectacle of destroying the prison, using explosives to reduce it to rubble. In their propaganda, they claimed that they were erasing a symbol of tyranny, presenting themselves as liberators of those who had suffered under the Syrian regime. However, this act was not driven by a commitment to justice. Rather, it was part of ISIS's broader campaign to establish its own brutal form of rule. The destruction of Tadmor was not about healing past wounds. It was a tactical move in a violent conflict. For many Syrians, the demolition of Tadmor did not bring closure. The crimes committed there had never been properly addressed, and those responsible had never been held accountable. The prison's destruction removed a physical reminder of its horrors, but it did not erase the suffering of its victims. In some ways, it even denied future generations the opportunity to fully document and investigate the atrocities that had taken place there. Without a trial, without justice, and without a formal acknowledgement of the thousands who had perished behind its walls, the story of Tadmor remained unfinished. The question remained, was the closure of Tadmor truly the end of an era, or merely a shift in the methods of oppression? Many former prisoners feared that even if Tadmor no longer stood, the tactics of torture, forced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings would persist elsewhere in the country. The regime's grip on power had not loosened, and political prisons still existed, operating in secrecy. Tadmor was gone, but its shadow remained. Even though Tadmor Prison is no longer standing, its legacy continues to haunt Syria and the wider world. The horrors that took place within its walls did not simply vanish with its demolition. For the thousands of victims who suffered there, the trauma remains deeply embedded in their lives. For their families, unanswered questions still loom. And for Syria as a nation, Tadmor remains a painful reminder of the brutality that has shaped its modern history. For former prisoners, survival did not necessarily mean freedom. Many who were released from Tadmor were permanently scarred, both physically and emotionally. The brutal torture they endured left them with broken bones, lifelong health problems, and deep psychological wounds. Many could not reintegrate into society, haunted by nightmares of the beatings, executions, and constant fear they had lived with inside the prison. Some were unable to speak about their experiences, while others were too afraid to do so, knowing that the government was still watching. Families of those who were imprisoned in Tadmor have also carried the weight of its legacy. For decades, they lived in uncertainty, not knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. Many never received official confirmation of what happened to their fathers, sons, or brothers. The lack of justice and accountability meant that their pain was never acknowledged by the very authorities responsible for their suffering. For them, Tadmor was not just a past horror, it was an ongoing source of grief and injustice. Beyond the personal suffering, Tadmor's existence contributed to a culture of fear that shaped Syrian society for generations. It was more than just a prison, it was a tool of control. The mere mention of Tadmor was enough to silence critics, suppress dissent, and discourage any form of resistance against the regime. People learned to censor themselves, to avoid speaking about politics, and to distrust even their own friends and family. The fear of imprisonment in a place like Tadmor became deeply ingrained in the national psyche. Internationally, Tadmor Prison became one of the most well-documented examples of state brutality in the Middle East. Human rights organizations used it as a case study of how authoritarian regimes use detention centers to eliminate political opposition. The testimonies of survivors provided chilling evidence of the methods of torture and repression used by the Syrian government. These accounts were crucial in shaping global discussions on human rights violations, torture, and the treatment of political prisoners. Yet, despite the awareness raised, meaningful justice has remained elusive. The perpetrators of the atrocities committed in Tadmor have largely escaped punishment. No high-ranking officials have been held accountable for the massacres, the systematic torture, or the inhumane conditions. While some lower-level officers or defectors have been implicated, the core architects of Tadmor's brutality continue to live freely, their crimes unpunished. This failure to achieve justice has only deepened the wounds of the victims and reinforced the idea that powerful regimes can commit crimes against humanity without consequences. Tadmor's legacy also extends beyond Syria. It serves as a warning of what happens when absolute power goes unchecked, when a government is allowed to use fear and violence as a means of control. It stands as a historical example of how oppressive regimes weaponize incarceration to maintain their grip on power. Even though the prison itself is gone, its story continues to be told, reminding the world of the dangers of tyranny and the importance of fighting for justice. For many, the true end of Tadmor will not come with its demolition, but only when those responsible for its horrors are held accountable. Until that day, Tadmor will remain more than just a chapter in history. It will be a symbol of suffering, resilience, and the unfulfilled pursuit of justice. Tadmor Prison may have been demolished, but its memory cannot be erased. It remains a symbol of the worst forms of oppression, a place where thousands suffered and where justice was never served. The voices of those who perished still echo in history, reminding the world of the dangers of unchecked power and the cost of silence in the face of tyranny. For Syria, Tadmor is both a wound and a warning. It serves as a painful chapter in the nation's past, yet it also stands as a lesson for the future. A reminder that no society can truly heal without justice, accountability, and the courage to confront its darkest moments. Until those responsible for its horrors are held accountable, and until the full truth is acknowledged, Tadmor's legacy will remain unfinished, a ghost of history that refuses to be forgotten.